Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you listen. And we are starting our Christmas season at our church, and we are going to be looking at one of the great passages that talk about our Lord Jesus Christ and his coming. And this is approximately 700 years before Christ was even born. And yet it was something on the mind of God. It was important to the world. This world that we have is a stage on which the greatest salvation work that has ever been wrought in the universe was brought forth. And they gave a hint as to what was coming, where it would be, and how it would affect the people who saw his coming. Let's open our Bibles, if we would please, to Isaiah chapter 9. And we're going to be spending approximately 3 messages on this passage of 7 verses, because there's a lot to unpack in here. And so in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 1, he says, "But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish." And the word her is in reference to the people personified as a she in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali. So it says, "There will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish." In earlier times he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But later on he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea on the other side of Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Well, now, that's a lot to unpack. Why was God upset with that area? Why did he treat them with contempt? Must have been pretty bad. And Naphtali and Zebulun, where did those names come from? And what is this great light that they will see? And sometimes it helps to look at a map. I just happen to have one made right here as a map, but it's not going to be all that helpful for you on the screen. But the people that are listening to the message on Sunday will be able to see it quite well. But suffice it to say that Naphtali and Zebulun are, if you look at a map of Israel, are on the left side of the Sea of Galilee in that area. And so that is the pardon me. That's the area that is going to be having the great light that's going to come upon them. But it's gloomy right now. Well, what has made it so gloomy? Well, we'll come to that. So Zebulun, that was one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And Zebulun was the 6th son of Leah. Jacob had married what he thought was Rachel, but didn't turn out to be Rachel. It turned out to be Leah. And he was tricked into having her as his wife, and then he was given Rachel as the one that he wanted. And so he ended up having 2 wives. And these sisters were jealous of each other, and they competed for the love of their husband by trying to have as many children as they could, thinking that the husband would love the one who had more children. Well, Rachel was barren, and Leah was quite fertile, and she had 6 sons. Well, Rachel couldn't hardly stand this. She said, "Give me children or else I'll die." And Jacob said, "Am I in the place of God?" And so she had a maid that was watching her and kind of taking care of her. And if a woman could not bear children back at that time without in vitro fertilization and all these other things, they did it the old-fashioned way. And since this woman of Bilhah was her slave, she said, I want you to have children for me, and you will bear the children on my knees. And what actually they did is when that maid, who was made like a wife, second wife to Rachel, when she became pregnant, she actually sat on the uh, legs of Rachel. Rachel sat down in a chair, and then Bilhah sat on her lap. And when the child passed through Rachel's legs, it was symbolic of saying, this is my child too. And so she had a son and then another son. And when she had this son that was named Naphtali, that meant the struggle is on and I am having children and my husband will love me. And then finally Zebulun was born, the sixth son, and she named him Habitation, thinking that because she has six sons, her husband would love her more. It was all in their mind. I'm thinking that Rachel was always loved a little more, but he did love them all, and he was caring for them and certainly cared for all of his children. But this is where the names Zebulun, the habitation, and Naphtali, the struggle, came from. And the most famous city of Zebulun is Nazareth. Isn't that interesting? That's where Jesus would grow up, is in Nazareth. And that was part of the great light that was seen. And then Naphtali was a little bit closer in to the Sea of Galilee. And the cities that were most prominent in them were right around the Sea of Galilee. And people like to live near the water just like people do today. And you had Capernaum, which is where Jesus lived for 2 years. That's where Peter's home was, and Bethsaida and Chorazin. As a matter of fact, they had such great light that Jesus pronounced some difficult words when he was there. He says, woe to you, Bethsaida and Chorazin, because of the miracles that were done in you had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would be remaining till this day. Those 10 believers that they lacked, they would have probably got them, which is interesting because God knows the what ifs. But at any rate, here is Bethsaida and Chorazin, who saw great light, and with great light always comes more responsibility. They fell into disfavor with God. Now, why was that? Well, you had David as king. Then you had Solomon, who was from David. And Solomon was married all these wives, and he started to get into idolatry. And because of that, God decided, although he would honor his promise to David to have a man who was going to be Messiah, it wasn't going to be through the bloodline of Solomon. And he then had a son named Rehoboam, who was the next king, and God ripped the kingdom away from Rehoboam. Rehoboam only had 2 tribes with him, Simeon and Judah, and the other 10 tribes went with a man named Jeroboam. Now that always gets confusing because Rehoboam and Jeroboam sound very similar, and the Jeroboam is from the northern kingdom and Rehoboam is with Judah and Simeon. And so they split, and Jeroboam was worried that when people went down to worship at Jerusalem, that they would start becoming united again by their common faith. And he didn't want them to go down to Jerusalem and get worked over, and politics and all things being the way they are. He said, that's just too far for you to go. We're going to make it more convenient for you, and we're going to have a town that you can go to, 2 of them. You can go down to Bethel, which is before you get to Jerusalem, or you can go up to Dan, which is in the north. And you know what they instituted? Golden calf worship. Now, where have you heard that before? So this really ticked God off. I mean, he was not pleased with this golden calf worship. I think he thought he had made it plain there at the bottom of Mount Sinai when he took that golden calf through Moses' actions, ground it up and made him drink it, and people were swallowed up by the earth, and all kinds of terrible things had happened. Well, golden calf worship. And so they fell into disfavor with God for the idolatry. And if it weren't for Jonah, it would have been sooner. Because there was this town named Nineveh. Now, Nineveh comes from Nimrod, who in their language was called more like Nunu. And therefore we got the town Nineveh, which he founded. And that is from that scallywag, Nimrod, who was a great conqueror of people. And so Nineveh had this very aggressive and very strong desire to conquer people. And they were very, very cruel, and they kept people in line by their cruelty. You do what I say, or I'm going to come and pull you away with hooks in your nose and disembowel the mothers who are pregnant, and we're going to do all kinds of awful things to you. And they did. And so they were hated. They were seen as the most cruel type of people, the Ninevites. And God said to Jonah, I want you to go up there and tell them a thing or two. And Jonah suspected that the reason why God wanted him to go there is because they would repent and get saved. Well, you think that's a good thing, but he hated them. He didn't want to talk to them. So he got on a ship and he went the opposite way. And the ship, God caused a storm and was preventing the ship from getting away. And they said, everybody pray to their gods. Well, Jonah was down in the belly of the ship sleeping. They woke him up and they said, don't you care if we perish? And he says, well, I don't want you to perish. Why don't you pray to your God? Because my God's angry with me, and this is why this storm is going on. Well, what should we do? He says, throw me overboard. That's your only hope. And they didn't want to do that to their credit. And they rowed even harder. And finally, they were so exhausted. They thought, well, what recourse do we have? We'll throw him over. They threw him over immediately. The storm stopped. And I mean, these people had the fear of God. Here was Jonah causing the fear of God in people, and he wasn't doing the right thing. And so he had a giant creature come and swallow him, and some think Jonah died, and some think he just was in a coma. But, just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale, or sea monster, 3 days and 3 nights, so too must the Son of Man. Son of Man died, Jesus Christ, and then he raised the third day. It could be that Jonah, the sign of Jonah, greater than sign of Jonah, would be here in Jesus Christ. So anyhow, he got burped up on the land. I imagine the stomach acids of that animal were starting to digest him. His skin was probably bleached, and he probably looked awful. And he was walking to Nineveh, and he came to that great city. He looked like walking death, and he told his story and how he didn't want to preach to them, but here's the message. The message is God's going to destroy you people. And so God had them repent. They were moved from the king all the way down. Even the animals fasted. They weren't given anything to eat or drink, and the whole town was converted in some way. They feared what God could do to them, and they responded. Well, this gave 30 more years before Nineveh turned mean again and came and invaded this area. And in 733, Tiglath-Pileser came in here, and he beat them. and he deported these people, and then he brought another group of people in. Let me show it to you. Look at 2 Kings. Okay, we're looking at 2 Kings. Come on, Kings. There's Chronicles. I need to go a little bit farther over to Kings. And I'm looking at 17. 2 Kings 17 and verse 6. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, captured Samaria and carried Israel away into exile to Syria. So when it says carried them away, he just captured the population and he brought them out of there. That's how he pacified them. They weren't going to be there anymore to cause him any trouble. And he settled them in Halah and Habar on the river of Gozan, and the city and in the cities of the Medes, as in the Medes and the Persians. And then, at the same time, as it says in verse 24, the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Kothah, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the cities of Samaria in the place of the sons of Israel. So they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. Now, can you imagine what happened? He said, who would like to go and to a good land that's better watered than even around here? And you have homes, and there are fields that are tilled, and people would say, well, I've got nothing here, I'll go. And so a lot of these people were from the dregs of society, and they moved those people into the Zebulun and Naphtali area and had a good setup. And, God was not pleased with them because they brought their idolatry, and he allowed a plague of lions to kill them. It says here, at the beginning of their living there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have carried away into exile in the cities of Samaria do not know the customs of the God of the land. They had a very low view of gods, and the gods didn't have a whole lot of power outside of their land. But if you were in their land, they had a great deal of power. That's what their thinking was. They didn't realize God of Israel was the God of the universe, God of the world. But nevertheless, there was these lion plagues, and so they sent to the king of Assyria and said, we don't know how to pacify the God that's in this land. Can you send us a priest that was deported? And so this guy came, taught them some things. Well, they just did it to pacify, they thought, the God of Israel. They didn't really believe it. And they still practiced these other religions. And so it was a very syncretistic, mixed thing. And these people became known as the Samaritans. And although they had kind of a Jewish veneer to them, these people were looked down upon because they had all kinds of syncretisms. It says here, but every nation still made gods of its own, verse 29, and put them in the houses of the high places which the people of Samaria had made, every nation in their cities. And it even lists a number of these gods that they worship. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, the men of Cuth made Nergal, the men of Hamath made Ashima, and the Avites made Nibhaz and Tarkak, and the Serbivites burned their children in the fire to Adramelech, and Amalek, the gods of the Sepharvaim. They also feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves priests of the high places. But I mean, it was syncretistic. So when Ezra and Nehemiah came back from the diaspora some 7 years later, the Samaritans said, "Well, let's help you build the temple." And they said, "We don't have nothing to do with you guys because you don't even believe right. You don't fear the Lord only. You got all this other stuff that you do too." So here's the situation. The area of Naphtali and Zebulun had a bunch of people there who were more Gentile than they were Jewish. And so they were not well loved. And the few Jews that were perhaps still in the area were just grieving and feeling bad. Can you imagine? We live in Michigan here. Can you imagine some foreign power coming in and taking 90% of the population away and moving in a bunch of other people that didn't care anything about our traditions and our beliefs? And we would just feel like we were violated. We would feel like we were invaded. And these people would try to fit in, but they also had all these strange beliefs. Well, that was the situation. And then by the time Isaiah gave his prophecy, he had this to say in Isaiah chapter 9. All this to unpack why it says here, "But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish." Zebulun and Naphtali had been completely turned upside down. There won't be any more gloom. In earlier times, he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But later on, he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea, on the other side of Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Now, the word great light is used in Genesis. He will make a great light to rule the day and a lesser light to rule the night. But this great light is a spiritual light. And they will see a great light, and those who live in the dark land, which is spiritual darkness, the light will shine on them. You shall multiply the nation, you shall increase their gladness. They will be glad in your presence, as with the gladness of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. So, this area, even during the time of Jesus, was a highly Gentile area. There were Jewish people that lived there. There were some Jewish cities. Nazareth had a synagogue in it, but also it had a lot of syncretistic things. And there was even a worse area between Jerusalem and Nazareth. That was Samaria. And even the Jews, when they were going to Jerusalem, they would not go down through Samaria. They'd go across the Jordan, then down on the east side and ford the Jordan again, rather than go through Samaria. But Nazareth wasn't all that far away from Samaria, and the influence and all that stuff, it was just lumped together. And Nazareth was a very difficult town to be raised in, and that's where our Lord grew up. And so when Philip said, "Hey, come and see, we have found Jesus of Nazareth," and then Nathanael said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And so Philip said, "Well, come and see." So evidently Nathanael did come and see, and as he came to see Jesus, Jesus said, "Ah, at last an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael had a way of just saying what he thought. He wasn't coy. He was just very straightforward. And he said, "How do you even know me?" And Jesus said, "I saw you when you were under that tree. Now that doesn't seem like it means very much. What do you mean you saw him under a tree? What's the big deal? But evidently, Nathaniel had a religious experience and committed himself to God in a very unique way, perhaps in that under a specific tree, and he was just pouring his heart out to God. And Jesus Christ, knowing this through the power of God, said, I saw you when you were under that tree. Isn't that interesting? God can see you. You might be sitting in your living room and you might be pouring your heart out to God, and you might be asking God to reveal things to you or give you a sense of direction in your life. And then somebody comes along and says, God wants to give me to give you a message. Because he heard you when you were sitting on the couch, and you say, wow, how did he know that? And that becomes, therefore, a profound thing for Nathaniel, and he was impressed by this. And so something glorious was occurring, and it was starting to happen with the revelation of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, when it says here, the people in darkness will see a great light, that is picked up by Matthew. And as he quotes this passage, he sees the fulfillment of that prophecy. In Matthew chapter 4, and we're looking at verses 13 through 16. And leaving Nazareth, he came and settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who were sitting in the darkness saw a great light, and those who were sitting in the land and shadow of death, upon them a light dawned. Well, you see, it was called Galilee of the Gentiles because all those people had come in, been brought in. And so there was a whole lot of Gentiles. Even the Greeks, during the time of the conquering of Alexander the Great, he brought in a bunch of Greek people that lived in that Decapolis area, 10 cities. Decapolis is not one city, it is the name of an area, and has 10 major cities. It was in the Gilead area and around the Sea of Galilee, a very nice place to live at the time. And so the people who lived in darkness shall see a great light. This light was spiritual, and many, many miracles had been done over there. So many miracles, in fact, that Jesus could hardly come and go. People were crowding around him. There were people that came to Peter's house, and they wanted to get a man to him, and his house was just stuffed to the gills, and people were standing outside, and they wanted to get this man healed, and so they went up on top of his house, tore off the roof, and let this man down. He had such a big crowd one time that he had to go out on a boat and speak to them so that they could hear him. It was a natural amphitheater, and the water acted as a bouncing mechanism to let his voice go, and then up the slight hill that was there, and thousands of people could sit there. At the death of John the Baptist, he decided to have a retreat, and I'm getting ahead of myself. He went over to the other side, and that was the area of Decapolis. And there was this man who was a Gadarene demoniac. You might see it also as Gerasene or Gadarene. All three of those occur in the Bible, and they mean the same area. And in Mark chapter 5, this demoniac, we find out that there were two of them actually, but in one passage it just mentions the one. That doesn't contradict, it just says that they only mentioned the one for reasons that seem good to them. And in Mark chapter 5, and starting with verse 1, they came to the other side of the sea. They went across the Sea of Galilee into the country of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with the unclean spirit met him, and he had his dwelling among the tombs. Interesting. Demonic people, demons like to be around death. And no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain. The demon gave him kind of a supernatural strength, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. And no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains and gashing himself with stones. Sad situation. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him. The demonic beings inside of this man knew exactly who Jesus was, and shouted with a loud voice. He said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Never met Jesus. He knew exactly who he was. "I implore you by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Now, legion is a number of, you have like the legions of Rome, and they had like maybe even up to 6,000 people in one legion. And he said, "I am Legion, for we are many." There were many of them. And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. That meant more than just leave Ohio or leave Gerasene area. That he didn't want to be sent to the bottomless pit. That's what he was referring to. There are reasons to believe that. It's an educated statement. And it says here in verse 11, "Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on that mountain." Now, Jews don't eat pork, but Gentiles do. And there was this large herd of swine. Later on in another passage, we hear 2,000 swine. And the demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." And Jesus gave them permission, and coming out of the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, there it is, and they were drowned in the sea. Now, that's a lot of swine to be drowned. And the demons, I think, if they had known that if they went into these swine, they would be drowned, they didn't want to do that either. But you know how when the demon was in the man and he was always cutting and gashing himself, this is what people who are demon possessed do. They become destructive to themselves. And when they went into the swine didn't have any brains at all, really, to resist the demons, and they ran headlong into the sea and drowned. Well, this made a scandalous thing occur. I mean, the fear of the Lord fell upon all these people. What in the world caused all this? And can you imagine the carcasses of these swine floated all over the Sea of Galilee? And everybody in the area was asking, where in the world do all these swine come from? I mean, here's thousands of swine floating on this sea. And it was just telling everybody something very significant happened. And the story would get around. And this man who had the demon cast out of him was in his right mind then. And he said, "Let me follow you." He may have been a Jewish man, I don't know. Let me follow you. And Jesus said, no, you stay here and you tell what was done for you. He said in verse 19, and he did not let him follow him, but he said to him, go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis, those 10 cities, what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. That's part of the great light. That's part of what happened. Well, John the Baptist gets beheaded, and Jesus came back to this area to kind of have a retreat, and he went to kind of a grassy, uh, uninhabited area. And the people from all over the lake saw him going there because he was quite the news person now. They wanted to see what was happening, and the people from the Decapolis area came there too, and he fed 5,000 men, and if they had their wives and their children with them, that crowd could be upwards of 25,000 people, and he fed them. And so they were seeing this great light, and they wanted to make him king. And he had to send them off a little bit at a time and dismiss them, because although he was to become king one day, he had first to deal with the sins of man on the cross. He put his disciples in a boat, and he told them to row across the lake. Well, a storm was coming up here and was preventing them from coming. Meanwhile, he has to get over there somehow himself, and he does the miracle of walking on the water to get to the other side. And he gets to the ship, and they say, who are you? Are you Jesus? And he says, yeah, that's me. And Peter said, if it's you, bid me to come to you. And so he gets out of the boat. I mean, Peter's got real brass. And he gets out of the boat and he's walking on the water. And then he's thinking, I'm walking on the water. Good grief, I'm not supposed to be able to do this. And he looked at the sea and the storm, and it was still raging. And he started to sink. And he says, God, save me. And so Jesus reached up and pulled him out. And they got in the ship, and in no time they were at the shore. Now, this is all part of this great light that came to that area of Zebulun and Naphtali, and the feeding of the 5,000. And as we look, therefore, in closing up, it says that they had great joy as in the time of harvest or dividing of spoil. So we see here, therefore, that there was this great light, and it came to the area. And Matthew cited this Isaiah 9 prophecy 700 years before it actually happened. He now brought it forward and said, look what God is doing. For the people of Zebulun and Naphtali have seen a great light. And that's all wonderful and good. But the most important question is, have you seen it? Do you know who Jesus Christ is?